There are these huge institutions, pillars of our world, really, but the origins often feel, well, murky, almost deliberately so. The Federal Reserve is definitely one of those, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It casts such a long shadow over our economic lives, yet how it began. It's shrouded in a kind of mystery.
Exactly. And that's why we want to dig into it today.
We need to look at that creation story, that famous 1910 meeting on Jekyll Island, and the mechanics behind it all, like fractional reserve banking.
And also those critical views, like G. Edward Griffin's, which argue there's more going on than meets the eye, perhaps even manipulation.
Definitely. It's a perspective that's out there, and understanding it is key to grasping the whole picture of our financial system. Or, as Griffin might put it, how it potentially doesn't serve everyone equally.
Okay, so that's our mission for you listening today. Central banking, it can feel really dense, right? Almost impenetrable.
Yeah, very technical.
We want to cut through that. Our aim is to shed some light, pull out the key facts, the surprising bits, without getting bogged down.
And we'll be drawing heavily on Griffin's analysis from the creature from Jekyll Island. Now, it's fair to say his views are controversial, definitely provocative.
Yes, they've certainly stirred debate. But it's a viewpoint that deserves a closer look, regardless of where you personally land on it.
Agreed. It provides a critical lens, a different way to think about the Fed's power and influence. So where should we start? That Jekyll Island meeting seems like the place.
Perfect. Let's set the scene. It's November 1910. A very exclusive, very remote island off the coast of Georgia.
Jekyll Island, yeah. And this group arrives. Incredibly powerful men. We're talking people representing maybe a sixth, even potentially a quarter of the entire world's wealth at that time.
It's staggering, and the secrecy was intense. They traveled under the radar, used only first names, pretended it was a duck hunting trip.
Duck hunting, anything to avoid suspicion. It really underscores how sensitive this meeting was.
So who exactly was in this duck hunting party?
Well, you had Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, a major political player, Republican whip, head of the National Monetary Commission, and interestingly, John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s father-in-law.
Talk about connections.
Exactly. Then Abraham Fiat Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and the finance heavyweights, Frank Vanderlip from National City Bank, representing Rockefeller and Kuhn, Loeb interests.
Okay.
Henry P. Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan, Charles D. Norton, president of another Morgan bank, Benjamin Strong, also tied to Morgan via Bankers Trust.
A lot of Morgan influence there.
A huge amount. And Paul Warburg, a partner at Kuhn, Loeb, representing essentially the Rothschild banking dynasty in Europe. It was a powerhouse group.
Unbelievable concentration of financial power in one remote cabin. So what was their goal? If we follow Griffin's argument, it wasn't purely altruistic public service, was it?
Not according to Griffin, no. He argues their primary driver was self-interest. They wanted to create a central bank, a cartel really, that would benefit them.
How so? What would it do for them?
Well, Griffin suggests several things. One, reduce competition from newer, smaller banks cropping up across the country. Two, gain control over the reserves of all banks.
Centralized control.
Precisely. Three, and this is crucial, create a system where if their banks got into trouble, the taxpayers would ultimately foot the bill. The whole too big to fail concept, its roots are arguably right here.
Okay, that's a big one.
And fourth, perhaps the most fundamental, gain the ability to create money. Essentially out of nothing.
Creating money out of nothing. We definitely need to circle back to that. But first, the plan they hatched on Jekyll Island, it didn't immediately become law, right? There was the Aldrich Bill first.
That's right. The initial plan, heavily influenced by Senator Aldrich, was floated as the Aldrich Bill. But it ran into trouble.
Why?
Aldrich was just too closely associated with Wall Street. There was a lot of public pushback, suspicion that it was a power grab by the big bankers.
Makes sense. So they needed a rebrand.
Exactly. And that's where Paul Warburg apparently stepped in. He suggested changing the name, making it sound more official, more governmental, less like a private banking initiative.
So names like the National Reserve Bill, or eventually
the Federal Reserve System Bill. Much better public relations.
a smart move politically. And this rebranded version, the Federal Reserve Act, it passed in 1913.
It did. And the timing is often pointed out. It was passed just before the Christmas break for Congress, when many members had already left Washington.
Convenient, perhaps.
And signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson, who, it's worth noting, had received significant campaign funding from some of the very interests behind the Jekyll Island meeting. Griffin certainly highlights that connection.
Right. And this idea of protection they were seeking, the government connection, that links back to the bailout idea, the taxpayer safety net.
That's Griffin's interpretation, yes. that by creating this quasi-governmental entity, these private banks secured a backstop. They could privatize profits, but socialize losses, essentially.
Okay, so that's the origin story, the alleged motives. Let's shift to the how. How does the system actually work? Let's talk about fractional reserve banking.
Right. This is fundamental to how banks operate and central to Griffin's critique about creating money.
So fractional reserve. For you listening, the basic idea is that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank doesn't just lock it away in a vault.
No, not at all. They're required to keep only a fraction of that deposit in reserve.
Yeah.
Hence the name. Maybe 10%, sometimes less.
And the rest, the other 90% or so.
They lend it out to businesses for mortgages, car loans, you name it. That's how they make money, on the interest from those loans. This is how credit expands in the economy.
Which fuels economic activity, building homes, starting businesses.
That's the conventional view, yes. But Griffin sees it very differently. He describes this process as, well, manufacturing money out of nothing.
Strong words.
He even calls it a kind of legalized counterfeiting, because banks are lending out money based on deposits they don't actually hold in full. That $90 lent out exists simultaneously with the depositor's claim to their original $100.
So if banks are creating money this way, by lending out more than they physically have in reserve, what are the potential downsides, according to Griffin?
He sees several major problems. First, inflation. When banks create more money through lending, it increases the overall money supply. More money chasing the same amount of goods and services generally pushes prices up.
Which erodes the value of the money people already have.
Exactly. It eats away at savings. Second, he argues this system is inherently unstable. It contributes significantly to the boom and bust cycles that plague economies.
Those periods of rapid growth followed by crashes or recessions, you're saying Griffin links that directly to fractional reserve banking.
He does. He believes the expansion and contraction of credit, amplified by the fractional reserve system, is a primary driver of that economic volatility.
Okay, and tied into this is the nature of our money itself. It's fiat money now, right? Not backed by gold or silver anymore.
Correct. The US dollar, like most world currencies today, is fiat money. It's declared legal tender by the government, but it isn't convertible into a fixed amount of a physical commodity like gold.
How does that shift away from gold fit into Griffin's analysis?
It's critical for him. He argues that detaching money from gold removed a major constraint on government spending and money creation. With a gold standard, the amount of money is limited by the amount of gold reserves.
But with fiat money,
The government and the central bank have much more flexibility, some would say too much flexibility, to expand the money supply, often to finance government spending or manage the economy.
and the result of creating more money, again, is inflation.
Yes, Griffin calls inflation a hidden tax, and an unfair one. It doesn't require legislation, it just happens as the currency is debased. And it tends to hurt savers and those on fixed incomes the most.
Those whose wealth isn't primarily in appreciating assets?
Exactly. People holding tangible assets like real estate might keep pace or even benefit, but people holding cash or bonds lose purchasing power.
Griffin also talks about something called the Mandrake Mechanism. What's that referring to?
Ah, yes, the Mandrake Mechanism. It's his term for how the Federal Reserve essentially turns government debt into new money.
How does that work?
Well, when the government spends more than it takes in via taxes, it issues debt, typically treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve can then buy these bonds on the open market.
Okay.
When the Fed buys those bonds, it pays for them by crediting the seller's bank with new reserves money that didn't exist before. It's essentially monetizing the government's debt.
So the Fed buys an IOU from the government and pays by creating new digital money in the banking system.
That's the essence of it. And because of fractional reserve banking, that initial injection of new money can then be multiplied throughout the banking system as banks use those new reserves to make more loans.
Further expanding the money supply.
And, in Griffin's view, further fueling potential inflation and those boom-bust cycles. It's a key part of his critique of how the whole system operates.
All right, so we've got the history, the mechanics. Let's really lay out Griffin's core case against the Fed. He's not just critical, he advocates for its abolition based on 7 main points, right?
Yes, he presents a very direct case. 7 reasons. First, he claims it's simply incapable of achieving its stated objectives, like ensuring economic stability. He points to the historical record depressions, recessions as evidence.
So point 1, it doesn't actually work as advertised.
Point 2, he argues it's not a public institution serving the public, but a cartel run by and for the benefit of private banks, shifting losses onto taxpayers.
The too big to fail idea again. Okay, number 3.
3, he calls it the supreme system of usury. His definition of usury here is charging interest on money that the lender, the Fed, or the banking system essentially created out of nothing.
Interest on fiat money created via fractional reserve. Got it. Number 4.
4, it generates inflation, which he views, as we discussed, as an unfair hidden tax that erodes wealth.
Okay, that's 4. What are the last 3?
5, he contends that the Fed encourages and enables war. How? By allowing governments to finance huge military conflicts through borrowing and money creation, rather than solely through direct, politically unpopular taxes.
Easier to fund wars if you don't have to ask taxpayers directly for all the money up front.
That's the argument. 6, it actively destabilizes the economy. Far from preventing booms and busts, he argues the Fed's manipulation of money supply and interest rates actually causes them.
And the final point, number 7.
7, he sees the Fed as an instrument of totalitarianism. That sounds extreme, but his reasoning is that central banking concentrates enormous economic power, enables massive government growth and debt, and ultimately diminishes individual freedom and national sovereignty.
That's quite a list. Let's explore a couple of those further. The war financing point, he connects the Fed directly to specific wars.
Yes, he explicitly mentions World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. He argues that the scale of modern warfare wouldn't be possible without a central bank facilitating the necessary government borrowing and spending through this fiat money system.
Removing the fiscal constraints that might otherwise limit conflict.
That's his assertion. And on the boom-bust cycle point, he places significant blame on the Fed for the Great Depression, correct?
Absolutely. He argues that the Fed's policies, especially contracting the money supply in the late 1920s and early 30s, turned what might have been a recession into a catastrophic global depression.
And he sees that pattern repeating, creating artificial booms through easy money, followed by inevitable busts when the credit bubble pops. Yes, he views that as an inherent feature of the system the Fed manages. Manipulation of interest rates leads to malinvestment and unsustainable booms.
Now, there's another concept he introduces that sounds, well, quite conspiratorial to some ears, the Rothschild formula. What's that about?
Yes, that definitely raises eyebrows. Griffin uses the Rothschilds as a historical archetype for powerful international banking families. He alleges a formula where these families profit immensely from war by, well, financing both sides.
Financing both sides of a conflict.
That's the claim. The formula, as he describes it, involves steps like using war to create massive government debt, backing both contestants so you profit regardless of the winner, using crises to keep nations indebted, undermining or eliminating governments that resist the debt system, and ultimately profiting from the cycle of conflict and reconstruction, all enabled by central banks facilitating the lending.
So war becomes an engine for generating debt, which benefits the lenders.
That's the core idea behind his Rothschild formula argument.
Yeah.
He sees central banks as indispensable tools for this kind of alleged global financial strategy.
And he connects this to a larger agenda, something about global socialism.
He does. He argues that the Federal Reserve isn't just a national institution, but part of a larger movement towards global governance, potentially a form of global socialism in his view.
How does he make that connection?
He points to international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, which often work closely with central banks. He suggests their loans and programs, while ostensibly for development, actually increase debt dependency and erode national sovereignty.
Paving the way for it.
A potential world fiat currency managed by a global central bank, and ultimately a form of world government where national independence is diminished. He sees the Fed as instrumental in this trend through its global influence and promotion of fiat currency and debt. He even mentions groups like the Council on Foreign Relations as pushing this agenda.
Okay, we've laid out a lot of Griffin's case here, which is, as we said, quite critical and far-reaching. It's crucial, though, to acknowledge the other side, the criticisms of his work.
Absolutely essential. Griffin's book is widely read, but it's definitely not mainstream economic thought. Many economists dismiss his claims as overly simplistic, conspiratorial, or based on a flawed understanding of monetary economics.
What are some specific criticisms?
Critics argue he overlooks the potential benefits of central banking, like managing liquidity crises, acting as a lender of last resort, and attempting to moderate the business cycle, even if imperfectly.
They'd say he paints too negative a picture.
Yes, and that he perhaps attributes too much deliberate malice and coordination where incompetence or complex systemic factors might be at play. There's also criticism that his analysis carries a strong ideological bias, maybe anti-government, anti-socialist, or overly focused on a gold standard perspective.
And does he offer solutions beyond just criticism?
He does. His main proposals are quite radical from a mainstream perspective. One is for the government to essentially print money to pay off the entire national debt, an idea most economists believe would trigger hyperinflation.
And the other?
To abolish the Fed and phase out fiat currency, returning to a system where money is backed by precious metals like gold or silver, or return to commodity money.
Okay. We've covered a huge amount of ground from that secret meeting on Jekyll Island, through the mechanics of fractional reserves and fiat money, right up to Griffin's sweeping critique and proposed solutions. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. And trying to visualize how all these players, concepts, and arguments connect can be tricky.
Which is why, for you listening, we've put together something special. We created an exclusive visual mind map that lays out these complex relationships: Jekyll Island, the Fed's structure, fractional reserves, Griffin's arguments. It really helps clarify things.
Yeah, seeing it visually can make a big difference in understanding the flow of these ideas.
You can find the link to download that mind map right in the description below this deep dive. We definitely recommend checking it out.
And if you're finding this exploration helpful, if it's making you think, please do hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps others find this information and ensures you won't miss our future deep dives.
Okay, so wrapping up, let's summarize the core takeaways from Griffin's perspective.
In short, Griffin presents the Federal Reserve not as a benign governmental entity, but as a powerful cartel created in secret by elite bankers for their own benefit.
He argues its core mechanics, fractional reserve banking, fiat money, are inherently flawed, leading to inflation, boom-bust cycles,
and enabling government overspending, particularly on war. He sees it ultimately as a threat to economic stability, individual liberty, and even national sovereignty, potentially pushing towards global consolidation of power.
It's a powerful, albeit controversial narrative. And whether you agree with Griffin, disagree, or land somewhere in between, grappling with these ideas is important.
Understanding the history and the critiques, even the provocative ones, is part of being an informed participant in discussions about our financial system.
Which leads us to a final thought for you to ponder. Considering the arguments we've explored today about the Fed's origins, its power, its potential impacts, what does it mean to be an informed citizen regarding monetary policy?
What responsibility, if any, do we have to understand these complex systems that shape so much of our lives? And perhaps even to influence their future direction.
Something to think about. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and form your own informed conclusions.
This has been quite the journey into the creature from Jekyll Island.
It certainly has. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and definitely check out that visual mind map in the description.
It'll really help piece it all together.
And thank you for listening to the Inspired Podcast.